Good evening. Let me extend to you a warm welcome to the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies and to this evening's program. The program consists of a lecture and then a panel discussion. Let me begin by acknowledging former Governor General, Lady Hall, Sir Kenneth Hall and Lady Hall, Senator Auburn Hill, members of the Diplomatic Corps, leadership of the University of the West Indies, in particular Ms. Mina Israel, Special Advisor to the Vice Chancellor. I should tender his apologies. He's traveling. I know he would want to be here, but I'm sure he's going to catch this on UWI TV when he has a chance. Staff, academic staff, faculty, students. I want to recognize the head table. Galina Sotarova, World Bank Country Manager in Jamaica, who is the inspiration behind this evening's proceedings. And a special welcome to Valerie Hickey, who is an expert and practice manager in environmental and natural resources in the global practice of the World Bank. I want to recognize the panelists so that when it's time for them to speak, they will come to the podium in the order in which I'm going to read out now without further introductions. Let me tender the apologies of Dr. Damian King. He's unavoidably not going to be here, and that is unfortunate for you because I then become the moderator. Our panelists, very distinguished panel, each have 5 minutes, which I'm sure they will exaggerate to 7, but not to 10. I forgot to bring my red sign that says 5 minutes. But I will indicate to you in some subtle form, like removing the mic, that it's time for you to reserve the rest of your comments for the question and answer period. The panelists will speak in this order. Elizabeth Emmanuel, Program Director, Vision 2030 of Jamaica Secretariat. Senator and Ambassador Auburn Hill, CEO of the Economic Growth Council. Then Dr. Henry Mooney, lead economist, Inter-American Development Bank here in Kingston, Jamaica. Dr. Justin Ram is going to zoom in from some part of the planet, not sure exactly where. He's on Rome. He's the chief economist of the Caribbean Development Bank, who I should mention also did a study of the blue economy. Okay, it seems to be anxious to start. Your time will come, sir. And then to close out will be Dr. David Smith. We're going to have question and answers from questions from the audience, both live and those that are sent in to us by electronic means. Working down to the least of the apostles, I should introduce myself. Richard Bernal. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs at the University of the West Indies. I think we have had a welcome and a long introduction, which is going to save us a lot of time later. It now remains for me to invite to the podium Galina Sotarova, World Bank Country Manager for Jamaica, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. I would consider all protocols observed, with your permission. This year marks 55 years of partnership between the World Bank and Jamaica. And since 1963, when Jamaica joined the World Bank, the bank has provided about $3 billion of financial assistance. But more importantly, throughout these years, we have been providing a lot of technical assistance, analytical support, knowledge transfer. And while there is an event, there will be an event, which we are planning for later this year to celebrate this anniversary of our partnership, we have also partnered with the University of the West Indies to hold a series of discussions on topics, on analytical work that the bank has done on topics that are of particular importance to the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular. And I'm very happy that the first of those discussions is on the blue economy and the potential of the blue economy for growth and jobs, on how to preserve and how to grow this potential. So, sorry. With this, it gives me really great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker this evening, Valerie Hickey, Practice Manager for Environment and Natural Resources in the Latin America and the Caribbean region of the World Bank. Valerie comes from Ireland, which you would probably guess when you hear her speak. She joined the bank as a technical specialist in East Asia and the Pacific, working on rural development and environmental safeguards in Cambodia, China, and Laos. And I'll stop with the individual countries where she worked at this point in time, just to say that she has worked across all of the bank's regions, including in fragile states, where she led the bank's environmental portfolio in Haiti following the earthquake in 2010. After joining the World Bank Global Environmental Team, Valerie became chair of the Blue Economy, Biodiversity, and Wildlife Communities of Practice, where she convenes the bank's technical expertise in providing policy advice and implementation support to partner countries to strengthen the contribution of natural resource management to poverty alleviation and blue and green growth. Now, as practice manager for environment and natural resources in Latin America and the Caribbean region, Valerie manages a cross-sectoral team that provides technical assistance, convening services, and most importantly, capital at scale to governments, communities, and companies on issues related to the blue economy, forestry, sustainable landscape, pollution management and environmental health, environmental economics, and environmental risk management. And a few words before joining There's Life Before the Bank. Before joining the bank, Valerie worked for World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the U.S. National Park Service. And Valerie holds a PhD in environmental science and policy from Duke University. With this, please join me in welcoming Valerie to the discussion this evening.
Thank you, Galina. Ambassador, distinguished guests, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I have to admit that when I first saw that this was labeled a distinguished public lecture, I got quite frightened, because there's not a lot distinguished about me. But I told my husband, he said, "Don't worry, you've had lots of practice lecturing me, so just think about that when you're lecturing everybody else." So I really am thrilled to be here. It's my first time back in Jamaica in about 10 years. I used to do a lot of work here many, many years ago, working particularly on issues of environmental safeguards. And being Irish, I always felt very much at home here. It's not just the British influence and the history, it's not just the music, the dance, a little bit the drink. But it's also the fact that both of our countries are known for being places where nature is a big part of who we are. Whether it's inland in the mountains, whether it's seaward as we look towards the oceans. Now, there are some differences. You have incredible beaches here. It was one of my favorite things to do was to try and sneak a weekend in between meetings and go to one of the wonderful beaches where I'd see lots of Irish people, because even though we have beaches, they're very hard to see when you look through the cold and the fog and the rain at home. So we have to say we have the beaches, but we much prefer yours. But more seriously, one of the things that I find that joins our two island economies is that for too long, we've had our back towards the sea. And we've looked inwards to our land for our economic growth, for our jobs, for our GDP. And in both cases, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In Jamaica, for example, your ocean area, your ocean assets are 24 times the size of your land area. And yet your institutions, your rules, your regulations, they're 95% focused on that 10% of land. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why the blue economy is so important, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. So what is the blue economy? Basically, this is shorthand for all of the goods and services that can generate jobs and can grow GDP that come from our marine and coastal areas. Blue economy is all about growth. It's not about the environment. It's about how we can mobilize environmental assets to create jobs, to bring growth, to accelerate growth. As many of you know, the World Bank has been working on these issues with many partners from the UN, from the OECD, from the OECS Commission, many partners, to think about putting together what we call the blue economy approach. Because as economists have begun to look at the potential of the blue economy, the potential of coastal and marine resources, we realize that by 2030 alone, we think there is $3 trillion of value can be generated annually. $3 trillion. If you think about that in comparison to Jamaica, Jamaica's GDP annually is about $14 billion. The value that the Caribbean Sea itself holds annually is $400 billion. So while we have our backs to the sea, both in Ireland and in Jamaica, while we're looking to find those jobs in our GP inland, in fact, it's the waters, it's our coasts and our oceans that hold real value. But now most of us know this, and I think island economies in particular are beginning to recognize this very much. Island economies, we recognize that we can do to the oceans what we've done sometimes inland and have that same boom and bust cycle. We've done it traditionally with things like fisheries where we will fish out a particular species. We will move from one to the other. We will engage in the same type of boom and bust cycle that we see when it comes to exploiting natural resources. But we know we can't do that. We know we mustn't do that. We know that the future of jobs and resilience and growth lies seaward. Now, the good news is that we're already beginning to see countries think blue. Whether it's here in Jamaica with some great examples, whether it's elsewhere in the Caribbean or elsewhere, we're really beginning to see some success in the blue economy producing those jobs. Take, for example, fishing. Fishing is probably one of those sectors we immediately think of when we think of the blue economy. Right now, about 80% of fish stocks are fully exploited or overexploited. That's not a good statistic. Simply put, the race to the last fish is business as usual. There's more boats chasing fewer fish. This isn't particularly a path towards a sustainable future, towards any future. But what we're actually seeing is a shift. We're seeing a shift towards sustainable fisheries. It's a real-time response based in part on the fact that in the next 12 years, 2 billion more people are coming to dinner. 2 billion more people need to be fed. There simply isn't enough land for that many cows. We have to figure out how we're going to make sure there's enough fish. So how did it happen? How did we begin to think more carefully and seriously about moving towards sustainable fisheries and away from this rush to fish the last fish? First came consumer demand. So fish is an incredibly popular food source, and it's funny because fish is an important food source at both ends of the consumer spectrum. For 1 billion poor people, it is their main source of protein. It's what they eat when they have a chance to eat protein at all. At the other end of the spectrum, fish is some of the most expensive and the most sought-after food for the upper middle class and the wealthy. And in both cases, the desire for healthier fish, for more fish, for better fish, for fish from places we know it's coming from, is beginning to take hold. And that means there's a real consumer demand for things like traceability, for understanding that fish practices are more healthy and that they're supporting local communities, not undermining them. So consumer demand has helped begin that shift towards sustainable fisheries. So too has political will. This is a very important piece of the puzzle. This is often the excuse we use when we don't know why something good isn't happening. But in fact, in fisheries, we're seeing this shift. The World Bank did a report in 2004 where we analyzed fisheries, and we realized that $50 billion are lost every year from poor fishing. It's money left on the table from unsustainable fishing, from bad fishing practices. We updated this study last year. The number's gone up to $83 billion a year. Now, if you think about it, international global assistance from the World Bank, from IDB, from all of the charities in the world amounts to $174 billion a year. Half of that, again, is left on the table and not realized because of poor fishing. This is a number that ministers of finance sat up and listened to. This is real money. We're not talking about environmental issues anymore. We're talking about economic issues. We're talking about finance. So what we've seen basically is sustainable fisheries has become this pragmatic response to the political imperative to meet increasingly sophisticated consumer demands, to meet basic protein needs, again, for those 2 billion additional people who are coming to dinner in the next few years, and to the growing public appetite to see more fish harvested sustainably, and for ministers of finance looking to find those areas where they can diversify their economy and make money. So at the bank, we've supported lots of these beginning transitions to sustainable fisheries, and we have found there is real money on the table. In the Solomon Islands, for example, an island nation like yourself in many ways, for which fisheries is quite important. And what the Solomon Islands did, it's a country of 500,000 people, is they didn't themselves have their own fishing industry necessarily. So what they were doing was they were allowing distant nation fleets to come in and fish, particularly for tuna. And they were basically selling their fish for $1,500 per vessel per day. Sounds like a lot of money? It wasn't. In the last 5 years, we've worked with them, and we've been able to increase that amount to $6,000 per vessel per day. So they're immediately seeing almost a 4-fold increase in their inland revenue. This is real money, and for a small country with 500,000 people, this is incredibly important. We've then found private finance to come in and support a tuna factory on the island. So rather than just selling access to the fishery, now they have a place where they're selling access on the condition that that fish is processed locally. And that's generated 1,900 jobs, mostly for women. It's 1,900 jobs on an island of 500,000 people. This is suddenly becoming a really interesting sector, one that the government not only sees as important today, but going into the future. And so that's really why the World Bank cares about this issue. Sometimes we're accused of caring about it from an environmental perspective. We care about the environment, but that's not our job. Tonight, tomorrow, 750 million people are going to go to bed hungry. It's our job at the World Bank to bring that number to zero. We can't do it without the oceans. We can't do it without healthy oceans that are contributing to diversified economies, healthy oceans that are producing the jobs and the GDP that are creating pathways out of poverty and into the middle class, which is the surest way to move out of poverty, to get that full belly that we all deserve. But we also know at the World Bank that the blue economy is not just fisheries. It's also about energy. The future of energy is offshore wind, it's wave energy. Oceans are critical for that. We know that transport is increasingly sea-based. The amount of money and goods that moves just through the Panama Canal in and out of the Caribbean Sea is enormous every year. A healthy ocean is critical for that. Nature-based tourism is the fastest growing sector of the fastest growing economic sector in the world, tourism. Tourism is the one sector that is blossoming everywhere, and nature-based tourism is growing the fastest in that sector. Why? Mostly because people want to come and sit on a beach. They want to whale watch. They want to fish recreationally, go out there and catch some of the wonderful finfish you have circling this island. They want to dive coral reefs. Again, we need healthy oceans for that. It's an incredibly important part of making sure we can generate those jobs and that GDP. But what we're concerned about is we all recognize that a strong blue economy needs a healthy ocean. Sadly, we also recognize that the oceans aren't as healthy as we need them to be, and the trajectory is getting worse by the day. So as we finally come to the realization that therein lies an opportunity to diversify economies to grow jobs, we're also finding that 10 million tons of garbage a year are dumped into the oceans. That's the equivalent of one garbage truck being dumped into the ocean every minute. So in the 20 or 25 minutes I'm going to stand here today, in the hour and a half, 90 minutes we're going to be here, that's 90 more trucks of garbage dumped into the ocean. By 2050, economists and engineers tell us there's going to be more trash and plastic in the ocean than fish. You can't eat plastic. In fact, we all eat plastic because we're eating fish that's consuming plastic. But that can't be the future where we look to for jobs and for GDP. So we know that a blue economy matters. We know it's built upon a healthy ocean. But how do we unleash the economic forces that will make the blue economy work for us, work for governments, work for communities, work for companies? I want to go back to the sustainable fishing example just to try and tease apart a little bit what we think helped begin that transition away from a race to the last fish and towards sustainable fishing. We think it's basically two things: markets and money. So markets basically have arisen for sustainable fisheries to answer that consumer demand, particularly at the higher consumer levels. Standards have tightened. It's very difficult, as many fishermen know here in Jamaica, to get fish into American or European markets where the best prices are paid. Even local hotels who are sourcing their fish locally, they want to know where that fish comes from. They want to know it was fished somewhere where there isn't lots of plastic, lots of pollution. So these issues of traceability, these issues of tightening standards have helped create a market that is forcing particularly big companies and export companies to move their fishing towards sustainability. Because if you're not sustainably fishing, you don't have access to those big lucrative markets anymore. But money also matters, and particularly for the artisanal fishers. Artisanal fisheries, small-scale fisheries around the world, constitute 90% of the labor force. And that's a labor force of about 37 million fishermen and women globally, mostly fishermen, but some fisherwomen. 90% of those people work in the artisanal and small-scale fisheries. And they land half the fish globally. And they have largely been excluded from access to finance, in part because fishing has become and has traditionally been a very personalized industry. One person has one boat. It's very hard to aggregate fishermen. Anybody who has tried to create co-ops in this sector, it is even harder than in small-scale agriculture. There are traditions that need to be overcome. But we're finding that access to finance is helping force that aggregation, helping bring artisanal fishermen and women into the light and helping them really to begin to be part of the global fishing sector rather than fishing for smaller and smaller fish at smaller and smaller prices. So as political will and public appetites open the door and markets and money are fast building sustainable fisheries, what can we learn from the example of sustainable fisheries for the larger blue economy? We think there are 5 keys to unlocking the wealth of the blue economy, to unlocking the power, which in and of itself can drive those jobs and GDP. So the first key, we believe, is improved science, technology, and data. There's no better place to say that than at UWI. The importance of building the capacity, building the scientific pipeline where we can understand that value of the blue economy, whether it's the economic or financial value, whether it's knowing where the fish are and where they're going to be in a warming world, whether it's understanding currents to really begin to trap that coastal wave energy. We need that science and data. We need this more and more. The second key really is about transforming what is often a wild west in terms of regulation into a much more of a sort of a planned regulatory village. As I said when I started, so many of our institutions, so much of our rules and regulations are built looking landward, not looking seaward. And when you look seaward, there's regulation that doesn't match. There's overlapping laws that are often contradictory. There are many places that are giving oil concessions and exactly those places where they're giving fishing concessions. There's all types and no types of coastal building regulation, which means there's investment in coastal infrastructure that won't last, or that is creating all sorts of pollution plumes that is undermining the other economic forces that are happening in the same space. So we really need to think about regulation in this space and making it much more consolidated and consistent. Regulation is only one piece of the puzzle, and that's why the third key, we believe, is institutional credibility. Laws are no good if they're not enforced. And these institutions don't just mean government institutions, though that's a very important piece. When I was looking at coming back here and giving this talk, I spent some time looking at the newspapers to understand how fisheries is seen in Jamaica these days, and read a lot about the use of the Jamaican Defence Forces and the Coast Guard, and how they're so actively engaged against IUU, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries, which is a very fancy way of saying they're trying to stop people stealing food and stealing jobs from Jamaica. These are the kind of institutions we have to build. It's institutions to create and provide business licenses. It's institutions among communities so that they can aggregate into co-ops, so they can begin to do business and do better business with the local hospitality sector, so that they can't be priced out of the market. So building these institutions at community level and at government level becomes a critical piece of being able to unlock the power of the blue economy. The fourth key is about building fit-for-purpose infrastructure. This is something sometimes we forget, is that at the end of the day, to create markets, you absolutely need rules, you need regulation, you need institutions that can enforce those rules. You need the data and the information and the science. But you also need infrastructure. You have to be able to get goods to market. My colleagues, Keiko and Maya, who manage our World Bank Fishery Project, just had a meeting this afternoon with fishermen from Rocky Point. And one of their big issues is, how do they get live lobsters into the American market? Where are the cold chain logistics? How do we provide them and help them get access to infrastructure so they can take a very high valued asset and make sure that it doesn't lose value because they simply can't keep it cold but alive? So building fit-for-purpose infrastructure becomes critical. And it has to be fit for purpose, not just in terms of the economic sector it's supporting, but in terms of us living in a warming world. And this is particularly important for island nations. Last year, this part of the world was hit again and again and again. And I know, and I'm very thankful that Jamaica was saved the worst of it. But you know, there were times last year when I started thinking about hurricanes not as natural disasters, but as the weather. So how do you begin to build infrastructure that is resilient against what we know are going to be these harsh events? How do you build infrastructure that's resilient against a rising sea, against an acidifying sea? We're doing an awful lot of work in West Africa where coastal erosion because of rising seas is eating into the land at a rate of 10 meters per year. That's 10 meters every year that villages are losing, who are progressively having to move back and back and back. How do you continue to invest? How do we help them proactively invest in infrastructure that's more further inland and yet maintain the social capital and the economic businesses they have on the ocean? These are the questions we have to ask. We have to build that fit-for-purpose infrastructure. But the fifth key is probably the one that's of most interest to us at the bank, because after all, we are a bank. And it's money. It's back to money. Money really, in some ways, does make the world go around. And for the blue economy to flourish, we need more finance. And we need all sorts of finance. And I think this is what we sometimes forget. And more than anything, we need finance that is an investment, that isn't a subsidy. We need finance that is an investment and that isn't simply aid. And that means there's 3 types of finance we really need to think about and we need to bring together to unleash the power of the blue economy. The first is that we need to mobilize domestic resources. Jamaica is a powerful economy. There's money here, and we need to think about how do we make sure there are investments made in the ocean and in coastal resources that will have immediate and long-term financial returns. How do we make sure that there are economic instruments, whether it's fees, whether it's the terrible T word, taxes, whether it's schemes like payment for environmental services or pollution payer principles that ensures that domestic resources and domestic actors are paying to use the resource and are paying to clean it up if they're not doing it. The hotel industry in this island, and not just this island, but everywhere, depends often on a healthy ocean. Nobody's going to sit on a beach that belongs to a hotel that is littered with trash. But yet very often, many of our hotels are dumping much of their trash and their sewage through an outfall into the ocean. How do we get them to begin to pay for managing that asset? So mobilizing domestic resources is very, very important. So too is using international public finance. So as I've said before, there's about $174 billion flows from sort of the north to the south every year. That sounds like a lot of money, but it isn't. And it's often money that's used to support global public goods, certain items and assets that are difficult to get a financial return from. So traditionally, we've often looked at ocean assets as those things that you can't get a financial return from, so we use aid. We have pilots. We support marine protected areas. It doesn't work very well. It's based on a misunderstanding that the ocean isn't an asset without financial returns, that we can create jobs and GDP from it. But there also isn't enough money that we can sustain that type of global public subsidy. And so we really need to think about a different way of using those flows from north to south, particularly because those flows are beginning to taper off. In particular, as many of you will have seen, capitals both in North America and in Europe are less and less willing to send money to middle-income countries like Jamaica. The appetite for doing that is beginning to disappear. So as official development assistance flatlines, particularly for middle-income countries, a new type of non-traditional development assistance is taking its place and is incredibly important and is going to be an incredibly important part of unleashing the power of the blue economy. It's making us rethink how we invest in development. A lot of new donors, non-traditional donors, like the Gates Foundation, for example, who have an awful lot of money, aren't willing anymore to simply provide funding for input-based projects. They want to pay for results. So it's really making us rethink how we do this work. It's pushing us towards paying for impact and not for inputs. And that's something we're not particularly used to. It's a real change in mindset. It's driving innovation. It's making us look for how do we make sure we use this assistance to leverage domestic public resources, to put in place those rules and those institutions that will help sustain those very results that this new development assistance will pay for. But the real money at the end of the day is not in public finance, it's in private finance. For every $1 that flows north to south, in public financing, in public philanthropy, $3 of private capital flows that way. $3 of private investment looking for somewhere to make money out of, to invest. Now, there's 2 constraints to that money being used in the blue economy, and to date, very little of this private investment has found its way into the blue economy. The first constraint is risk. The second is a pipeline of investable projects. When I said earlier that in many ways the blue economy is a regulatory Wild West, I meant it. When you talk to the big banks who have deep-pocketed investors looking for the next place to make money, we talk to them about the blue economy and they run away. Because they say, we have no idea how to understand that. We have no idea how to price risk. We don't know what success looks like. We don't know what the tipping points are, whether it's on something traditional like fisheries or whether it's in something new like wave energy. We just don't know what it looks like. And that's why it's so important that we invest in that improved science, data, and technology, that we think about the rules of the game, that we think about having institutions that can manage those rules, because that's how we will de-risk and attract private financing into the sector. It's also how we're going to end up creating a pipeline of investable projects. We need to start using domestic resources and traditional development assistance where we have it to really show proof of concept, to build the capacity of entrepreneurs, of small-scale industries, of small businesses, to create products and services that they can sell on the market, because there is money chasing opportunity. And a lot of that money increasingly is not just looking for the highest return, but it will trade some of that financial return for environmental and social return. And there's no better place to think about bringing those three things together than, again, in the blue economy. And so this is a place where we really need to look, and it's, in fact, introducing a lot of new actors into the agenda. One of the places we've begun talking, one of the groups we've begun talking to at the World Bank, and one of the groups that I think could have a role in Jamaica, is the global diaspora. Like Ireland, Jamaica has had a lot of people leave, and a lot of people who've done incredibly well outside of the country. Globally, the diaspora have savings of $400 billion a year. Again, more than twice the official development assistance flowing north to south. Where is that $400 billion? Most of it is literally under mattresses or in low-interest savings account. Because the diaspora, many people don't know what to do with their money. So we're looking to see how can we help them look back to their countries of origin, look back to the places where they come from, and invest that money. That's why these pipeline of investable projects become so important. And with these new actors in private finance comes a demand for new financial products. So we've been spending a lot of time at the World Bank thinking about how can we get insurance into this sector. We're currently working with CRIF to create a new insurance product for small-scale fisheries, particularly to protect them against devastation from climate change. We also have been working with Seychelles, and we've just launched the world's first blue bond. It's a small bond, but it's exactly an attempt to show that there is money that will chase opportunities in the blue economy, and there are financial products that will attract those new investors. So at the end of the day, there's lots we can do in the blue economy. But if you remember nothing else, I would leave you with three key messages. The first thing is that small island economies need ocean-based growth to diversify their economies, to attract investment, to grow jobs and GDP. We can't continue to have our backs to the sea. We have to change where we're looking to for our economic growth, for the future for our people. The second is that if we're to do that, and when we do that, and as we do that, we need to make sure that that healthy blue economy can last. So it needs to be built on a healthy ocean. So we need to think about pollution. We need to think about managing our ocean for the long term, not using it as a common ground and a common dumping source. And finally, we need to remember that if we're to do this, we have to work with communities, with countries, with companies, to ensure that they can invest in good policies, in better institutions, that they have access to the science, they have access to infrastructure, and they have access to finance. Because that's how we're all going to be able to access and mobilize our ocean assets, dive the depths of our oceans to deliver those jobs and GDP. Because we think we can take money from the ocean, we think we can take it in the form of jobs and GDP, and we think we can take it for a long, long time. But we have to think carefully about how to do that. And we have to work together, because I do think together we can unleash the power of the blue economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very informative and thought-provoking presentation. Just before I invite the panelists to make their presentations, I thought I would try to draw a few points together just as a framework for the discussion. And it seemed to me that there were 5 areas. First of all, the importance And I think I needn't regale you with the details of how important the oceans are. 2/3 of the planet. They provide food, transport, communications, energy. They also regulate the world's climate, and they are the basis of some very important industries like tourism, and a very significant share of the world's population lives on the coast. So for all of those reasons, oceans are critical. Now, oceans already make a significant contribution to the world economy, somewhere around 5 to 8% of the world economy. But more important than that is the potential, and that's the second area. The outlook is for continued growth of industries based on maritime resources, projected to grow at somewhere between 3 and 5% between now and 2025. The third area that we should bear in mind is the Caribbean. 40 million people, but 2.75 million square kilometers of sea. And that is only providing $53 billion for the island Caribbean. It provides over $400 billion for the wider Caribbean. Tourism industry alone is $50 billion. And the oil and gas industry to date is $6 billion. But we see export growth going to take place in Guyana and Suriname. Now, what is particularly important for the Caribbean is that we're coastal societies. Most of the infrastructure, population, economic activity, etc., is concentrated literally on the beach. And in many cases on the beach. We're not talking about 10 miles inland. A mile or two from the beach is where most of the infrastructure, housing, economic activity is. That's a concern in this region, which is so prone to natural disasters and is so open to action from the sea. But the important thing about the maritime industry is that you have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. That means, as you pointed out, that the resources of Jamaica are not confined to 4,400 square miles, but actually it's 40 times larger. And when you get to small islands like Grenada, smaller islands, it's even more. It's like 70 times. This is a vast resource. This is how Iceland has become a developed economy. 400,000 people. And this is what the Pacific is doing such a good job of exploiting. And that leads to the fourth area, which is the potential. The potential is enormous in tourism, in fishing, in energy, in communications, transit, shipping, trade, etc. And here we come to your presentation, which is we have to exploit this resource, but in a sustainable way. So we have to combine exploitation of opportunities with preservation. We have to limit the pollution, the overfishing, the coral reef destruction, etc. This is something we have to bear in mind because you don't want to degrade the very richness of this resource. And to do that, you suggested that unlocking this potential requires science, better regulation, better enforcement, infrastructure, and investment. Here I would just add that in these small developing countries where the maritime industry is so critical, they lack some of the capacity to do this, and therefore there's a role for regional cooperation and a role for global organizations in governance and in development assistance. And you added to conclude that none of this will happen without finance. 3 areas: domestic resources. You know, an opportunity is an opportunity until people see it. And you started by saying you look out at the sea and you miss the opportunities. Secondly, international public finance, development assistance, critical. And the untapped potential is the private sector. So with those few guiding remarks, I would now like to ask the panelists to come to the podium in the following order. Elizabeth Emanuel, Senator and Ambassador Auburn Hill, that's one person, not two. Dr. Henry Mooney, Dr. Justin Ram, who's going to zoom in, and Dr. David Smith. So, without further ado, please.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Well, I'm going to bring the notion of the blue economy to Jamaica and what we have been doing to capitalize on what the blue economy has to offer. And I'm going to bring that within the context of Vision 2030 Jamaica and our pathway to leaving no one behind in development. That's the title of my presentation today, Bruno. Okay, for most of you in the room, you have an idea of what Vision 2030 is. It's our country's first long-term national development plan designed to put Jamaica in a position to achieve developed country status by 2030. Essentially, what we're aiming to do is to transform this middle-income developing country to one that affords our citizens a high quality of life in a number of areas, whether that be world-class education and training or healthcare, etc. But we also want to be able to integrate the economic, the social, and the environment, and we want to recognize the importance of good governance. Today, we see Vision 2030 Jamaica as relevant as when it was promulgated in May 2009. 10 years into our implementation, I think we can safely say that many of the things we designed 10 years ago for 2030 remains relevant. We want to have a healthy and stable population. We want good governance. We definitely want safety and security. We want a stable macroeconomy and an economy that is growing, an enabling business environment. We want industry structures that are internationally competitive, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, but we also want a healthy natural environment. So how then do we maximize the potential of the blue economy? These marine and coastal resources that we have here, that component of natural capital, can it help us to achieve the Jamaica that we want by 2030 and that place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business? First of all, I want to say that if you think of anything, it seems to have been captured in Vision 2030 Jamaica. And that was because of the strategic planning that took place. And it's important to know that whilst in Vision 2030 Jamaica, you would see the words green and economy right next to each other. Because we spoke a lot about green economy, and Colonel Khan, who's here, can attest to that. They're side by side. We cannot say the same for blue and economy. They're not side by side in Vision 2030. But let me hasten to add, because UETV is here, that whilst this is so, Vision 2030 Jamaica recognizes that the sustainable development of the marine environment, the resources and the ecosystems, and the sustainable management and use of those resources. And we recognize that these will contribute to prosperity for today's generation and for future generations. And we need to remember that we're all going to be a part of a future generation, because we're all going to live for 21 years. And that's my alarm going off, so can somebody go in my handbag and just take it off? Thank you. So importantly, Vision 2030 Jamaica does propose the sustainable management of our marine resources and that we use them in sustainable ways, our coral reefs, or seagrass beds, or fisheries. Indeed, one of the 15 national outcomes that we are aspiring to is the sustainable management and use of our environmental and natural resources. The plan proposes the advancement of economic growth, social inclusion, and the improvement of livelihoods. And we're talking about sustainable livelihoods within our marine environment. We need to pay particular attention to the goods and services provided by the marine environment. So it proposes goods such as fish and shellfish, but equally important, we need to recognize it proposes the recognition and the sustainable management and use of the genetic resources and from our marine environment. understanding the importance of our marine environment to shoreline protection, treating waste, providing employment, and maintaining biodiversity. All of these areas I have mentioned that are included in Vision 2030 Jamaica, what we propose are really underlie the principles of what the blue economy is. And we are doing a number of activities today and capitalizing from the blue economy under the current implementation plan of Vision 2030 Jamaica, which is our medium-term socio-economic policy framework. So for example, many of you would know about the development of the Marine Spatial Plan for the Pedro Keys. We have policies being finalized, such as the Dolphins Policy, the Queen Conch Management Plan. We have, I think, probably the largest exploitable amount of Queen Conch in the Caribbean. Our fisheries, we are exploring species diversification for export purposes. So yes, we hear a lot about fish, but what about things, Auburn, like sea cucumbers, which are in high demand in Asian countries? There are other marine resources that we can exploit. They are in demand for medicinal purposes, and we're looking at that through public-private partnerships right here in Jamaica. We're expanding our fish sanctuaries. We now have 18. 10 years ago, we may have had 5 when you were last here. The Fisheries Bill, which the World Bank would support for promulgation, will be a dynamic bill. It will be transformational because it will not just speak to sustainable development of fisheries, but it will focus on food security and also enhancing sustainable livelihoods of that sector. Of course, collectively, we know that there is a lot more that we can do. Right now, we're developing the 4th medium-term socio-economic policy framework, and we did a scanning exercise before we began that process. And there are a number of new and emerging areas that we must take into account in development planning in the medium term and to 2030. So we came up with a lot of issues. Things like aging population and young demographics, we have to think about that. The emerging communicable diseases and the re-emerging communicable diseases, possible implications of Brexit, the notion of innovating to zero. Where are we going in terms of zero waste, closed loop manufacturing, and of course the blue economy. So when we finalize the medium-term framework, the 4th one, blue and economy, will be side by side. Because to 2030, we see it as a priority strategy going forward for Jamaica. And as we go forward, what is emerging in this planning process is the strategies that we must think about. We must determine the economic value of our marine and coastal ecosystems. And we need to know the cost associated with losing these ecosystems. This must be a priority under Vision 2030 for going forward. It will enable us to make better economic and social decisions. It's easy for us to determine the value of, say, our fish stocks, but we have not taken the time to determine the value of our genetic resources. What if the genetic resources in a coral reef holds the answer for prostate cancer? We have not explored those relationships as a country. So we need to begin to do that. We recognize under Vision 2030 the importance of restoring degraded coastal ecosystems, and emphasis must be placed on our marine and coastal ecosystems, not just coral reefs, but seagrass beds and wetlands, among others. We need to make greater use of economic instruments for environmental management as a means of guiding behavior towards environmentally responsible activity, whether that is for consumers, businesses, and even the public sector, and away from undesirable action. So we need to have a system of incentives and disincentives. We need data on the state of ecosystems to guide decision making. And I'm pleased that this year, NEPA will prepare an up-to-date State of the Environment report, and we must impress on them the importance of so doing on a more timely basis. We need to manage waste. It must be a priority. And we not only need to reduce it, but we also need to look at land-based sources of pollution. We need to move to zero waste, closed-loop manufacturing, cleaner technologies. Under the new MTF, we'll be looking at the greater use of strategic environmental assessments in decision-making to guide policy formulation. We need to ensure that an agricultural policy, whether it's a poverty policy, includes environmental consideration, and there's a cross-sectional approach to the development of those policies. And on the softer side, we need to increase awareness of the general public of the importance of the marine environment, as well as infusing it into the curriculum. How do we institutionalize the importance of the blue, green, and circular economies? And it would be remiss of me not to mention the Promoting Community-Based Climate Resilience in the Fisheries Sector project, which is being financed by the World Bank for us to enable us to actually benefit from and capitalize on this blue economy. So that program will strengthen the fisheries and aquaculture policy and regulatory framework, which you mentioned and diversify livelihoods within the fisheries sector. Can a fisherman also be a tour operator? Like scuba dive operator? And as we speak about climate change, that particular work also would look at building the resilience of the fisheries sector. And there are many more projects that we could mention here, but remember I have 7 minutes. He's going to move the mic. No, it hasn't gone by my watch. Under Vision 2030 Jamaica, as I close, we recognize the importance and the advantages of a blue economy or a sustainable pathway to development. And we recognize that pursuing a pathway that involves the green economy and the blue and circular economies will undoubtedly lead us to the changes and the Jamaica we want, eliminating poverty, contributing to high levels of growth, social inclusion, amongst others. And importantly, we will also play our part in contributing to Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 4 of those goals. 8, which speaks to decent work and economic growth. 12, responsible consumption and production. 13, climate action. And 14, life underwater. I think we can safely say it's not perfect, but we are on the pathway to development where we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Dr. Bernal, the reason why I have 2 titles is because my office saw Doctor this, Doctor that, Doctor the other, and got permission from Jamaica House for me to use 2 titles this evening. So I was very happy to hear Valerie mention the importance of economic growth that the blue economy can bring to us. And economic growth is what I'm about these days as the CEO at the Economic Growth Council. And so as I thought about this subject, I realized how important it is to get certain things right. I'm going to give you an example. I chair the tax reform working group of the Ministry of Finance, and in there I found the following. A law was put on the books in 18-something another. 18 early. It controlled the importation of cattle from wherever they should come from, very often from the United Kingdom. And High Commissioner, I don't mean to take you on this evening. You know we're going to play tennis tomorrow morning. So this is all friendly. But that law has been there from another period in our lives. And funnily enough, it says that you cannot import live animals into the country unless you do ABCD, rabies and whatever you did, that was dogs and whatever you do to cows. Well, in 2018, that is stopping and almost killing our lobster trade. That law, which we're now going to make sure, I'm going to make sure I do everything to change it, as the head of the working group and as a legislator, to make sure that people can bring lobster in here, employ women, some men, hopefully a lot of women, to do and look after our lobsters for export. Because right now, we allow our friends, we still call them friends, although they do this to us, not their fault, our fault, to come in and ship and fish our lobsters and take it to a nearby country, do all they have to do and make all the money and send it to the United States and Europe, wherever they send it. So, and we're not blaming our colonial masters. We have been in charge of this law for far too long for it to be there. But I'm telling you where it's coming from. So we have to do certain things and you know why? Because I'm leaning on you again, Valerie. Because we look to the land and not to the sea. We were looking after cows and wouldn't see that this law about cows would affect lobsters in the sea. We never looked at the sea. I checked with Professor Bernal, and he reminded me that the width of Jamaica is 79 miles. And look at the width we have in the ocean, 200 miles. We're going south in this instance, not north. So we have all that space in the ocean for growth. We have been dependent on an extractive industry, bauxite, for a long time. Well, we know what a certain president is doing with bauxite and the products that come from bauxite just north of us. Completely outside of our control. And if that change wasn't there, bauxite is an extractive industry, we're not going to have it forever. We have 200 miles of sea south of us, and we need to look at that and change our laws. Those overlapping regulations that we heard about, we need to change them to make sure the ones that control lobsters, not cows or dogs, because that too will affect quarantine and all those kinds of issues. So we need to make sure that we adjust our regulations. And luckily we're at a time in Jamaica when all those things are under questions. They're all being questioned. And because, again, of economic growth, because as we look at economic growth at the Growth Council, I've arrived at a two-sided, I can use this word in this environment, a dichotomy. When I'm talking to fishermen and farmers, I don't use that word. So we look at the dichotomy, and this is it. To make growth happen, you have the enablers on one side. That generally means the government, Economic Growth Council, local government, NEPA, the building people who approve buildings and approve roads, all those are enablers. Some of them think that they do growth, but the truth is they don't. They hire contractors who do the stuff for them. On the other side of the dichotomy, apart from the enablers, are the implementers. The implementers are private business people who must make investment decisions to make growth happen. The enablers must work with the implementers to make that happen, and there's no better place to do that in the sea. And that takes me to money. You mentioned $175 billion flowing south. Well, let me put that in perspective for you. Apple, know that company? iPhone people? MacBook people? They alone, just them one, alone, when Trump changed the laws recently, President Trump changed the tax laws, have $254 billion to take back to the United States. That's 45% higher than the entire flow that Valerie spoke about going south from multilaterals and others that are government related. The tax Apple paid on that is $38 billion. That's 270 times the size of our GDP. 1 year, one tax, bringing back that money. That's the perspective of the kind of private money that exists. But we do need that institutional, grant, multilateral related money to help us, especially us in Jamaica. As we look at turning our direction away from the land and looking to the sea, because there will be necessary investment, lots of changes, studies to be made, helping farmers. And one way we're going to do that is something else we have been looking at recently. And that's the mother farm proposition, in that small farmers with 2 acres and 3 acres of land can't really do very much. But when Don Webby of Grace, as he has announced, says that I want to put in 300 acres of land, and I'll divide it among in 20 or 25 lot areas. Gasana-san of Megamart is saying the same thing. Progressive supermarkets are saying the same thing. They're looking at getting small farmers in, and frankly, they're using a model that a very successful firm has used, Jamaica Broilers Group, on which I serve as a board member, for many, many, many years. In that the chicken farmer gets a chicken house, but they give them the chicken, they give them the chicken feed, they give them the medicine, and they monitor them every week. That mother farm arrangement can be used in the blue economy. In fact, I suggest to you it's the only one that's going to work. Because the small fishermen, Valerie tell you, you can't get them together unless you use money. Money comes from the mother farm. So when you look at money, we have to make sure that works. Logistics is another thing that we're looking at in Jamaica. Look at where we are from Panama. City, the Prime Minister is very clear that logistics must be a major part. Logistics means the sea, because much of our stuff comes through the sea. And finally, my youngest colleague in the Senate, Senator Samuda, has taken this on with a passion. We must clean up the garbage and clean the sea. And I'm glad that he has many decades ahead of him to carry this forward. I will support him, and I expect to be around for a long time. That's my expectation. But we have to also, as we cleaning Jamaica and the ocean is one enterprise these days. So as we look for the money, as we look to do logistics, as we look at changing our laws to make sure costs don't affect fisheries and fishermen and lobsters, and as we look to make sure we make Jamaica clean, making the ocean clean is an important part of making Jamaica clean. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the invitation. My name is Henry Mooney. I'm with the Inter-American Development Bank. So I am the new lead economist for Jamaica, and I have to say I have to thank everyone for inviting me here, not only because it has been an important part of my education, I think, this early on. I only arrived in February. But I think it's had a very fundamental impact on at least the way I see myself as an economist. For the last 20 years or so, I've considered myself a macroeconomist. As you know, most economists do, we tend to believe that everything in the world relates to our particular specializations. But as of today, I have changed my designation to blue economist, at least while I'm here in Jamaica. And I will tell you why in a minute. But first of all, maybe a word about the IDB. As I'm sure you're all very aware, ours is an institution that supports this country and others in the region through financing, through technical assistance, through expertise, and through our power to convene. Not only financial resources, but intellectual resources from institutions like our partners at the World Bank in a number of areas. Now, our financing ranges from direct input and direct financing of infrastructure projects across the board, as well as budget support, which is more fungible financing, but is usually tied to conditions. As well as a good deal of resources put into technical cooperation and technical assistance and the provision of expertise. So I think when I look at the blue economy and the definition of blue economy, at least the one that is starting to evolve in my mind, I see that as really overlapping with almost everything we do, certainly in a country like Jamaica. So now, forgive me, I had a PowerPoint, but I was told by Ambassador Bernal not to try and put it up, so I will as economists tend to do, I may quote a few statistics, but I think that they're very important and very instructive in this context. Now, I started thinking about what is the blue economy and how does the blue economy really relate to Jamaica's economic structure. And as I started to look further and further, not only is it almost an all-encompassing term, you know, that relates to everything from financing to infrastructure to the structure of production of this economy, to the service map and to the public services that the government provides. So it was very hard for me to sort of come up with an analytical answer to that question. What is the blue economy and what is its contribution to Jamaica? So I took a shortcut and looked only at travel and tourism. which, as you know, is a huge proportion of the economy of this country. And even though that's only one slice of the bigger picture of what the blue economy means here, I think the numbers I'm going to share with you are very instructive. Now, travel and tourism, I found some projections and some research that related to the impact of travel and tourism on this economy, and it's divided up into three different pieces: direct impact, indirect impact, and induced impact. Now, direct means effectively commodities, accommodation, transportation, entertainment, industries. Now, this relates to travel and tourism, so accommodation services like hotels, food and beverage, other tourist services like diving, or et cetera, or tours. And then sources of spending, so things like expenditure from the domestic side and the government side in the sector. Indirect spending is effectively investment spending in the sector, not only private investment, but public investment. And then induced spending. Now, induced spending is defined in the context of the numbers I'm going to provide to you as spending by those who participate in the sector directly themselves. So they may not be the tourists, but they may be the workers who participate in the industry, what they spend on accommodation, what they spend on food, what they spend on transport. So when I started looking at these numbers, I have to tell you I was taken aback, right? Looking at the total contribution of tourism and travel to GDP, it's on the order of about 30% of total GDP today. Now, looking at some projections that seem to be quite credible, 10 years out, that contribution is estimated to increase to about 45%. So approaching half of the economic output of this country could be related to travel and tourism. And again, this is very blue in Jamaica because travel and tourism is in one way or another 100% related to the sea, right? So it's an under, basically, representation because it abstracts from several of the other industries. In terms of total contribution to employment, it's about 27.5% of employment in this country is related to travel and tourism. Projecting forward, that could be as much as 40% in 10 years. Looking at domestic spending, it is a relatively large proportion of what we can record, but of course domestic spending is also beset by measurement problems because of the informal economy. In terms of capital investment in the economy, it could be upwards of a quarter by 2027. Now, I could go on and on. I had more graphs in the presentation, but you won't get to see those today. But the conclusion is that in an economy like Jamaica's, the blue economy is the economy. There's really nothing that in one way or the other escapes it. And as has been mentioned today, the importance of investing not only in the existing industries and in making sure that they are sustainable, but also making sure that this economy is prepared to leverage this natural resource that you have, which is unlike many other, I mean, there are very few places outside of the Caribbean that can boast of a resource that is this important and that is this important to take care of. That the argument that basically everything that the IDB does here, from investment in infrastructure to supporting the government and public sector transformation to making sure that the macroeconomy is stable and sustainable, everything at the end of the day relates back to exactly this issue, right? That the blue economy is key. Touching on another point, without trying to go over in time, as was mentioned before, even though institutions like the IDB and our partners provide development financing, that can only ever be the small slice of the pie. It has to be the catalyst for private investment, and that private investment has to be not only in the delivering sectors like hotels, like the services around tourism, but once private investment becomes embedded in this country, there is a natural mechanism there by which those who have invested capital and want to see a long-term return on capital then become very interested in making sure that it is a sustainable environment. And I think from our perspective, that is the key objective of almost everything that we are doing here. We are trying to provide support financially, intellectually, in terms of capacity to the government to make sure that this is an environment that is stable and vibrant and sustainable and that is able to attract private capital And it is exactly that private capital that once it's here, especially foreign direct investment, greenfield investment, that is long-term investment, that private capital has an incentive in making sure that this is a sustainable environment, a green environment or a blue environment that is able to sustain the investment over longer periods of time. So I think without going too much further into what is a very, very broad topic, again, I wanted to thank the organizers for helping me realize that I'm actually a blue economist. And I think I'll order my new cards tomorrow. But we at the IDB are very happy to support the blue economy and the Jamaican economy through all of our initiatives, all of which you can very clearly map back to the word blue. Thank you very much.
I'm not disobeying my own instructions. I've been told by UWI TV that I must appear here so that I can cue Dr. Justin Ram. So I hope that he's seeing me and hearing me. May I say that the first three speakers concentrated on Jamaica, but this seminar is intended to discuss the Caribbean. So I hope the next two speakers won't confine themselves to Jamaica.
Pleasant good evening to everyone there at the regional headquarters of UWI in Jamaica. Coming to you from the Caribbean Development Bank's headquarters in Barbados, and I'll certainly be taking you through a sort of a regional approach to this concept of the blue economy. Now, very recently, we at the CDB have been looking specifically at the many challenges faced by our borrowing member countries here in the Caribbean. And we're about to publish a new paper called The Blueprint for a Resilient Economy. However, in that paper, we have identified a number of challenges on the 4 quadrants, as we would like to call them, mainly around 1, macroeconomic, which is low economic growth, high debt, low savings, declining foreign exchange reserves. 2, underproductivity and competitiveness, low ranking on the World Bank's Doing Business survey, large infrastructure gaps, weak governance, inefficient and costly transport links, high energy and electricity costs. 3, human development. We have very high poverty rates and high unemployment rates in the Caribbean, particularly high unemployment around the youth in our region. We also have problems of high crime and citizen insecurity, as well as problems related to gender inequality. And the fourth area of challenge is really around the environment, and this was played out significantly for us in the Caribbean last year with the passage of those Category 5 hurricanes. But we know that in the Caribbean, on average, our borrowing member countries suffer around 2% of GDP losses every year due to natural disasters. So within that context and in that background, we've also decided to look at this concept of the blue economy to see how the blue economy could assist us in alleviating and helping us with many of these challenges that we face here in the Caribbean. And what we have found, incidentally, is that the blue economy actually touches on a number of these areas, on the macroeconomic, the productivity and competitiveness, the human development, and on the natural environment. Now, of course, history, we all know the history of the Caribbean, and utilizing the oceans for our economic well-being is nothing that's new to us. We know that we have used the oceans for our trade. Recently, there have been discussions around looking at rich-to-reef concepts, how it is that we manage our onshore activities so that they don't have a negative effect on the oceans. But now this concept of the blue economy means that what we're trying to look at is the reverse. How is it that the blue economy can actually now have a significant impact for those of us who live on the land, that smaller percentage of our total economic zones? And so we have identified in our upcoming study on the blue economy, which we aptly call a Caribbean development opportunity, the blue economy. We have identified maybe 4 or so sectors or industries that we think could be integral for us to harness the many values associated with the ocean resources around us. The first is around aquaculture and fisheries. We know that we have been engaged in fisheries for a long time, but we think we have not done enough as it relates to aquaculture. How can we now farm the resources in the oceans? Because we know that relying solely on the natural capital, the natural fisheries that as they occur in the natural environment, that is now unsustainable for us. And we have to think about the aquaculture. Coastal and marine tourism, we are very well, we have been doing that for many years. The previous presenter before me indicated quite aptly how important that is for our economies. But however, we think that the renewable energy potential of the blue economy is also very, very important for us. Offshore wind energy, or even utilizing the wave resources to generate energy for our economies, is another area that we could perhaps look at. And as we looked at this, a fourth important component of this is really around marine transport. Marine transport as it relates to the movement of people within the region, however, but also as it relates to the movement of cargo. Now, when we look at this particular issue, we think that there are significant opportunities for us as a region to levy, perhaps have some type of blue economy tax on cargo that is going through the region so that we can have raise revenues for our governments in this way. Now, many of these areas that I have touched on requires some innovative mechanisms for financing. And I was pleased to hear Valerie speak about the blue bonds, because we think that, again, in the region, this is an area where we need to have and we need to look at in much greater detail. We also might want to look at debt for nature swaps, development impact bonds, the crowdsourcing as it relates to perhaps the diaspora coming back to invest here in the Caribbean. But one other particular means of financing that I think we should consider is what we have used to allow some of our board member countries to tap geothermal energy in the Eastern Caribbean. And we think it could actually be used for the blue economy. And that is a contingent recoverable grant, whereby we say as a development bank to the private sector, we will provide you with a grant to help you exploit the natural resource. It then turns into a loan only if your venture becomes profitable. So in many ways, we're taking the risk out of actually exploiting the blue economy in much greater detail. So I know that I'm almost out of time. So just to end my presentation, I would suggest that if we are to exploit the blue economy efficiently here in the region, we really need to consider the establishment of some regional agency that helps us manage the blue economy. We shouldn't be doing this only as individual sovereign states. We need to develop innovative financing mechanisms. And in order for us to do that, I think here in the development community, we need to conduct targeted feasibility studies and competitive analysis to see where our true competitive advantages lie in the exploitation of the blue economy. And lastly, just for me to say that as we do this, it is really important for us to ensure that as we exploit the blue economy, that this is done in a gender equal way, so that everyone has an opportunity to share in the benefits of the blue economy. I thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. As people have kind of hinted to you before, our relationship with the ocean has largely been one of putting in things that are bad for it and taking out all the good things from it. As a result, the ocean has become warmer, more acidic, and it's also larger, which is what accounts for the sea level rise. That's something which we shouldn't ignore, by the way. It's not just something about eroding our beaches. Half of the airport runways in the Caribbean are below 33 meters, and many of them are quite a lot below 33 meters. So as the ocean begins to rise more and more, our airport runways become more and more in jeopardy. The lowest one, by the way, is in Montego Bay, only 4 meters above sea level, if that. So what does that leave us, and what are the messages that I want to get across? One of them is that as far as the Sustainable Development Goals and as far as achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is concerned, we are lagging as a planet on Goal 14, that is life underwater. It's one of 6 or so goals where the world is doing extremely badly on. And if we want to look at that a little broader, we're also worried because climate is adding to the problems of our lack of progress in that goal. Particularly for countries which are worried about tourism because it is, well, employs a quarter of our people and is likely to be the mainstay of our economy. The ecosystems which tourism is based on in the Caribbean are all under a great deal of threat. Work by the University of Hawaii indicates that for seagrass beds, coral reefs, and mangroves, these are the 3 systems that mean that we have white sand beaches that people will visit. They will become under threat from unprecedented climate conditions as of around 2034. That's not very far away. What it means is that the systems that we take for granted, we can no longer depend on nature to maintain them in the way that we've been accustomed, and can no longer depend on nature to maintain them in a way that will make us all the money that we've made from them so far. So if we're going to be looking for economic growth and basing it on tourism, we need to substantially increase the amount of money we put into maintaining the environmental systems that give us that economic growth. And currently throughout the Caribbean, we're not doing this. There are very few, if any, government entities within the Caribbean, whether English-speaking or not, whether island or not, whose job it is to maintain a beach and keep it at a particular width. There definitely isn't one in Jamaica. We went through a long debate in the Grill about what we should do about the disappearing beach there, and as a country we decided we would no longer debate it, and as a country we decided we'd do nothing about it. We decided we wouldn't build a breakwater, but we have done nothing else about that. It is one of the 3 main tourism destinations in this country, and we're not protecting it. Doesn't make sense to me, but I'm not an economist. Maybe it makes sense to somebody. But we're not doing anything about it. We also have a somewhat strange relationship with fisheries. We are probably the world's largest exporter of queen conch, Strombus gigas. The only reason we manage it, by the way, is because it's on Appendix 2 of CITES, an international convention which regulates trade in endangered species. And Europe is part of that convention, and they told us, no, we don't want your conch unless you abide by that convention. So we started to abide by that convention. We also have spiny lobster. Both of these, by the way, are affected by the fact that the ocean is getting more acidic. Again, the amount of money that we put into managing those, whether it be in Jamaica or the rest of the Caribbean, is infinitesimal compared to what we'd like to earn from it. Marine science lags behind terrestrial science in terms of what it knows about the ocean, in terms of how it generates data, for a variety of reasons. We do not have the data we need to manage these systems, but we're not putting more money into investing in science to get those data. So, yes, we could have a blue economy, and we've heard that it should become extremely important, ranking up to about 40% of what we do in the Caribbean. But we're not managing it, and we're not putting enough money into managing the blue or the ocean or the coastal zone. We will not have a blue economy unless we maintain the basis of that blue economy, and currently we are not doing so. I would also venture to say that currently very few governments are thinking about really putting meaningful resources into managing what it is that is going to make our living. The last thing I want to share. none of the fish that we would like to fish need visas or any other kind of thing to move from one place to another. All of them require the management of all the islands in the Caribbean if we are going to manage those fish stocks. So it's not just about highly migratory and straddling fish stocks, of which there is a UN convention. It's about pretty much everything. The lobster that we eat in Jamaica were not spawned in Jamaica. Their parents do not come from Jamaican waters. Neither do a lot of other species. So if we manage only one end of it, then we're going to be stuck because somebody else isn't managing the other end. And that goes throughout the whole of the Caribbean. Hence the reason for things like the Caribbean Large Marine Ecosystem Project. Unfortunately, when we tend to talk about the Caribbean, we like to manage things according to language groups. Lobsters don't speak Spanish, English, Dutch, or French. Nor do they care about our territorial waters, and they don't notice the exclusive economic zone that they've wandered over. If we can't learn to cooperate effectively with our nearest neighbors, as well as our distant ones, we are not going to be able to manage our fisheries. So far, our experimentation has had some limited success, but only limited success. Definitely not enough to drive a blue economy. So there are several things we have to look at. One of the problems is that the biggest barriers are the governance barriers and the barriers which we put in place ourselves. But the good thing about that is, if we put them in place ourselves, we can probably remove them ourselves. So basically, it's about looking at CARICOM and trying to make sure we can manage the blue economy without regard to language groups or where the island is. And it's also about looking at the existing data that we need to drive and putting in a lot of investment, whether it be from government or otherwise. We do need a lot of work if we're going to be able to reap the benefits of the blue economy. We really do have to put investment in order to get the investment out. It's not something we can expect that nature's bounty will suddenly accrue to us. We've already reaped nature's bounty. Now we need to invest. Thank you.
I have to filibuster until two more chairs are put up here for the panelists. So I'll try to make it useful. Our first panelist reassured us that the 2030 vision is going to give more attention to the blue economy, and we're happy to hear that. Senator Ambassador Hill assured us that some of those old impediments which have been inhibiting investment in the blue economy, we're going to clear those out, and so investment should flow. We witnessed, I don't know if it was a light on the road, on the Mona Road that you saw, which converted you to a blue economist, but it's good to know that the IDB is now going to put lots of money into the blue economy. Justin Ram again assured us that the only way to tackle this is from a regional perspective, and that the Caribbean Development Bank continues to do work in this region. That's very reassuring. And finally, Dr. Smith made the important point that we need to preserve what we have and to protect it, and the only way to do that is for all of us that border and benefit from the Caribbean Sea to collaborate, because, as you say, the people and fish migrate and they don't recognize boundaries. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come up here just to make it easier for you to respond to the questions. The floor is now open for questions, either from the physical audience here or questions that have been called in to us. Well, please go to a mic and tell us the question in English.
Or Irish, that would be as well.
There's a mic.
Good evening, and Anita Mills from the Climate Change Division at the IDB. I wanted to ask Valerie, thank you very much for your lecture, Valerie, and for your insights for the rest of the panelists. It's been really insightful and a lot of learning here. I have a lot of notes from your lecture. My first question to you would be regarding artisanal fisheries. You mentioned that there's finance needed for artisanal fishing. So I wanted to ask, what's the World Bank experience and what sort of financial mechanisms have you come up for that particular support? And following up on your comment on more trash than plastic in the sea by 2050, I wanted to ask maybe Ambassador Ovin Hill or Elizabeth about status on the plastic ban in Jamaica. What has been the advance on that particular subject? And those are two for now. Thanks.
Perhaps we'll take them in bunches of 3. Could we have 2 more questions? Go to the mic, sir. Or the mic will come to you.
Panel from St. Elizabeth, we're so done by Medallion Hall. I believe that if fisheries is to be of significant increase in Jamaica, I think the place to take it, this panel, this discussion should have been in the Peter Pains of St. Elizabeth. That's where fisheries all started, and Jamaica will applaud this when they hear this because it is true. So fisheries for Jamaica, it's fisheries for St. Elizabeth, and therefore we will welcome that anytime that you're ready. If this was in St. Elizabeth, if this meeting was in the Peter Pains of St. Elizabeth, you would not have place to hold this panel. I can assure you that. Now, if I may go on a little further, I want the Privy Council, what are the related concerns that the Caribbean may have with the presence of or absence of the Privy Council? Does that have a direct on the World Bank's view of the Caribbean's ability to stand on its own? The argument still being quietly said is that the Privy Council is for the billionaire group. Caribbean health and laws are related to it. Socially equitable, blue growth. Self-reliance and endurance as a Caribbean economy and also as an independent country. Marketing. Tool roads maintaining good groundwork in each country between each sector of a given market. One example here in Jamaica is the connection between Port Antonio, Portland, and Norman Manley International Airport and its environs. Building a more reliable road infrastructure via St. Thomas, of course, this should be done using Jamaican and the Caribbean partnership.
Sir, we've gone about 5 questions. Could you hold the other questions and let's get through? You have given 3, and we had 2 here. Let's deal with those and we come back to you, okay? Anybody else want to make a quick one? Okay. No? Well, let's go with the questions we have now. Oh, one more.
I just wanted to follow up on the point that Dr. David Smith made. And it's how we get better alignment between sort of what we need, what we know we need to do. For example, we're talking here about creating a blue economy. And as he has mentioned, many of the actions that we have taken are counter to our ability to really create a blue economy. And this is something that we see across many areas as we try to develop our economy. And I think we need to talk about how can we get this alignment between real policies and actions that will lead us to where we want to go in terms of our objective with respect to, in this case, the creation of a blue economy. because that dichotomy, that split is something that permeates throughout most of our economic life here in Jamaica and other places.
Thank you. I've been using the time to figure out how to who should go first. So I'm going to let the ladies go first and then the gentlemen after.
Why don't, if I can, try and answer Ms. Mills' question about finance for artisanal fisheries. This is incredibly important to us at the bank because at the end of the day, we don't think the problem of industrial fishing needs public assistance. We think the markets can deal with that. But we think artisanal fisheries, who at the end of the day are 90% of the fishers, who are the people that we most want to get out of poverty, who are the people who most suffer from the boom and bust when the resource disappears, whether because it's moving somewhere else because of warming waters or it's because it's being fished out. So we're doing two things largely in terms of providing assistance to artisanal fishers. The first thing we're doing is we're providing a lot of grant resources just to train them and build their capacity to access other finance. At the end of the day, fishermen and women are businesses. They're entrepreneurs. They do incredibly difficult jobs, but they're not spending an awful lot of time thinking about what they do as a business. And so helping to build their business acumen, helping to build their ability to work together, to aggregate, to co-op, becomes extremely important. So providing the grant resources, the technical assistance, the convening services to do that. And a large part of that is we support a lot of south-south knowledge exchange. Fishermen, like many people who work on primary production, know what they do and know it well, and they don't particularly want to listen to someone who sits in an office in Washington, D.C. But they will listen to somebody who looks like them and speaks like them and lives the very difficult life they live in another country. And so we bring different artisanal fishers to visit other communities of artisanal fishers so they can learn from each other. And this becomes an incredibly important way to build this contagion of good ideas that we really want to see. Because as the gentleman said, fishermen are self-reliant, and at the end of the day, they want to find their own way, and that becomes important. The second thing we're doing is actually working with local banks. One of the biggest constraints to fishermen moving into a more sustainable production cycle is just getting loans. And part of the problem is banks don't know how to collateralize fishing. They don't simply know how to do that. There isn't a way of building collateral in fisheries. They don't usually take boats as collateral. They don't know how to price that. They don't take fish harvest because it's uncertain. And so we're working with local banks to build their ability to price loans in the fisheries sector. And we do that in part by creating first loss facilities in banks so they can take the risk. They can experiment with pricing and figure out what's worked, knowing that we will take the risk of any loss they make. And we do it again by introducing them to how artisanal fisheries work and to what the market will sustain and what we know is the growth in these particular markets. So we think those are two very, very important areas for artisanal fishers. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to deal with the ban on styrofoam.
I'll go with the finance part because I love to. But I want to go with finance with a difference. A lot of what I've seen in developing countries, and I've lived in a few, is that there is no equity money. Farmers don't even understand what you say by equity. Equity is the money that poor fishermen in this time and farmers need that they don't have to pay interest on, and they only pay back if they make a profit. Now, Dr. Ram spoke about a recallable bond situation, which is really a definition for equity. It's not like a preferred bond or something else. The issue of bond is a debt. Bond is a loan. Has to be paid back. A poor fisherman in St. Elizabeth doesn't have the money to pay back that loan. As we look to go to the blue economy, and I must ask my multilateral colleagues here from the World Bank, the IDB has done so much work in this and given us so much money, that we must look to a place where equity financing is provided by those multilateral institutions that are supported by nations. It's not good enough anymore to talk about even a blue bond. I like that, but that's for rich people, like Jamaica Broilers and Grace Kennedy and Megamart who have balance sheets and can talk about bonds. What on earth does a fisherman in St. Elizabeth have about balance sheet? But you can train them. You can train them to say, look, this money is to go this way, and you can monitor them. The same monitoring system that I spoke about that Jamaica Brawlers uses. The multilateral institutions, the development banks of the Caribbean, which are not enough, and they're not enough developmental because they don't like to think that some of their money will be lost, and when you invest in equity investments, some of it is lost. We need to get to a place where a pool of funds are put together so that farmers can benefit from this initial money under good, firm monitoring and training. And unless we do that equity financing, and I'm a banker, I lend money all my life for over 30 odd years. That's what I do. If I made any money, that's how I made it. So I understand lending, but I understand as well that you cannot make poor people better off with loans, even when, frankly, it is concessional.
Okay. I'm going to let everybody have a chance to speak and to respond to some part of the question. David, would you like to comment?
On the same question? Or?
Any part of any question.
Sure. All right. There was a question about aligning and how we manage to align priorities with actions. And I think there are a couple of things which we may want to look at seriously. And one has to do with looking at the value of nature, or looking at the value particularly of natural resources from which we make money. There a couple of things we could be doing here. One is looking at something called payment for ecosystem services. So for example, whereas most of us are quite accustomed to getting water piped into our houses for free, yes, it's for free, you're not paying for the water, you're paying for the pipes. We need to start paying more money to make sure that there will always be water in those pipes. We need to look as well at what is the value of, say, a beach. If the beach has a value, then we need to start figuring out, well, how do we maintain that value? How do we make sure we don't lose it? Economists looking at beaches in Jamaica, for example, have figured that if we continue to lose beaches at the rate we're losing them now, we're going to be losing tens of millions of dollars per annum. And we'll start seeing something like between 9,000 and 20,000 visitors per annum less, because there will be less beach for them to lie on. So if it is that our tourism product is a relatively simple one, you come here, you lie down on a beach, we need to make sure there's beach for them to lie on. That must have a value. If it has a value, in the same way that if you own a car and you pay a certain amount of the value of that car to maintain it, to keep on the road, you put a certain amount of the value of the beach to maintain it, to keep it there. We need to start looking at that. That argument has to be carried up to sort of to cabinet and to ministers and also to the private sector so they can understand it and put it into place.
If I could just pick up on that. I mean, I think both of these conversations on financing and the value of commons, I think, touches on a couple of very important issues that we are looking at the IDB, but that I think are also important pillars of any strategy to move forward. In terms of, the issue of the commons, right? I mean, there is a the commons problem is pervasive here in at least two dimensions. One, the natural resources, these tourism-related resources of Jamaica and other countries in the Caribbean. We need to find ways to better internalize the cost of their maintenance for the private sector. And that goes back to the point I was making before. I think that the private sector has to be the engine of growth if you think about it in a development context, because that is really the only place you're going to be able to find enough resources to be able to develop and sustain. So I think that points to questions about the system of taxation here for providers of services in that industry, and thinking more concretely about how you tax that sector in order to make sure that it is able to provide the resources in addition to government resources to do that job. And I think the other thing I would point to in a similar vein, which relates again to work that we are doing and plan to do more of here, and is an issue that I haven't heard very much about, but I think is very much related to the blue economy here, and it is climate change and natural disasters, and making sure that that Jamaica is making the right kinds of investments in infrastructure that is resilient, because ultimately, to sustain the blue economy here, that is one of the key issues, right? Because in order to sustain a tourism industry or an agriculture industry or an aquaculture industry, you need to be able to make sure that as climate change accelerates and as natural disaster impacts increase, this country is resilient to them. And that has to take place decades before in terms of investing in sustainable, high-quality infrastructure on the public sector level, among other things. So I think that those are the two threads I would point to here. It's the internalizing the costs of the commons, because that, unfortunately, in the past, the doctrine of providing tax breaks to attract tourism may not have provided the right incentives there. And then secondly, climate change, natural disasters, and investing in resilience. I think that those are two key pillars that we at the IDB are looking at very closely.
For a newly minted blue economist, you certainly have learned quickly. Elizabeth?
I think that it's important when we speak about things like alignment and action, the notion of participatory approaches to development. And when we think about things like the blue economy and we think about the fishing sector, we talk a lot about, much of the discussion is what we can do. But what is the role of, say, the fisher and the fishing community? And what is their experience? And how do we capture their experience of that marine environment and infuse that into national policy? How, for example, do we make, if we think of the fishing industry in Jamaica, for example, do we understand the dynamics of that sector? If we want to make change, who do we speak to? We don't speak to the fishermen. We can't speak to the fishermen because who really runs the cooperatives? Who sells the fish? And many of those are women. So the role of women in development also becomes important in many cases. I mean, it may not always be the case that all cooperatives are managed by women, but what is the role of women in that sector? I mean, recently a study was done in St. Lucia, which actually showed that the men went out to fish. So the men and the boat boys, and when they came back, they managed, the people who were selling the fish were the women. So to make decisions about, or to better understand climate change and issues related to fishery and fish stocks, and to assist with sustainable consumption and production, it was really the women that you needed to educate. So I think the notion about participatory development is important in policy development as a whole, and I think that's something that we need to bring on the table.
You say we need to educate the women, but they're obviously much smarter. They're at the higher end of the value chain in the fishing business already. I'd like to give the last response to Dr. Ram. It's 8 o'clock here, but it's 9 o'clock in Barbados, and this is real dedication. So I give you the last word on that basis.
Okay.
About the blue economy as a new sort of a frontier area for us. We should be considering this within an overall innovative approach to how we look at our economies as we move forward. I think we understand that for many of the artisanal fisher folk, many of them might be unbanked. And so, there's a lot of work going on in the region about how we now get more people banked via the use of digital. The digitization of our currencies is an important way in order to get more people banked. How do we actually now utilize things like mobile banking? So I don't want us to just only focus on traditional ways of doing finance and on traditional ways of doing banking. I think as we look at this as a new innovative area for us, the blue economy, let us also try to bring other innovations into this, thereby also improving the overall productivity of the sector as we go forward. And so I liked what the previous speaker spoke about also as it regards to cooperatives. What's the role of the credit unions as it relates to financing? And let me just say one last thing here. If we are going to ensure that the blue economy is successful, then the regulatory environment needs to be correct, and the doing business environment around the blue economy also needs to be correct if we are going to encourage greater levels of private sector participation in this. So in many ways, we want to harness a good public-private partnership approach to this. But in order for us to get the private sector on board, we're going to have to ensure that the doing business environment is actually conducive to get that private finance into the new, vibrant blue economy sectors that we have identified tonight. Thank you.
There'll be one last question. I'd like it to be a question not preceded by commentary and directed to one person on the panel.
Elizabeth has a question.
Oh, okay. Elizabeth, you have the question? Presumably it came to you.
No, it didn't come to me. It was on you.
While she brings that up, my predecessor at the Economic Growth Council, Maureen Denton, asked a question about how do we, just remind me, Maureen, in case I get it wrong, how do we align all these issues together and get the action going? I want to address that for a little bit, because that goes, believe it or not, in the realm of politics. We have super bright economists from the IDB who got converted on the way to Damascus called the university.
Along Mona Road.
On Mona Road.
On the way to the
University. Not Damascus,
he was
but
converted on the way
Mona
to the
Road.
university.
Okay? To the blue economy. Now, you think about this. How long ago you learned or knew anything about something called a blue economy? When you heard blue, you didn't say economy. You said something else. Okay? So this is new. I'm going to show you a little bit of Jamaica's experience, and it will apply to the Caribbean, I'm sure. For 40 years, we never talked about economic growth. We borrowed money, we spent it, we do all kinds of things with the money, and then our debt got to 147%, where we couldn't manage it, and we had to ask the IMF to come in and straighten us out. We never talked about growth. In fact, for the 4 years that we were going through that fiscal consolidation in this room, I sat here with the first public meeting with the IMF and the Bank of Jamaica and those people back there. We had a group back there, and we talked about fiscal consolidation for 4 years. And we got it. We actually are now down to about 102% of our debt from 147 and getting below 100 in a short while. We got it. Economic growth, we have talked about it for 2 years to the point where people now actually do talk about economic growth and not so much fiscal consolidation anymore. The conversation has changed. For the blue economy to take hold, for a bright economist from the IDB not to be converted on the way to the conversation, like I was sort of, we have to make sure this comes into the public sphere, into the public square, where we begin to talk about the blue economy and talk about the sea as a part of our natural resource. So, Maureen, I just want to take up on that question. And to get the alignment, the discussion has to be broadened first, where policymakers begin to understand that I can tell you, many of our politicians, and I don't care which side of the aisle you look on in Parliament, they don't know about the blue economy. If they're learning, they're just beginning to learn. So we have to make sure we get that conversation going to policymakers, to businessmen. Businessmen in this country never talked about investing in agriculture. Now I have them. We're talking, every time I get to them, I say invest in storage for agriculture, agro-processing. We can't wait for people from Spain and Israel and the United States to invest in agro-processing and storage. Jamaican investors, Jamaicans have money. We know that because we know the money. I see the numbers from the central bank. So we need to get Jamaican investors front-ending it. We're going to have to get Jamaican investors to front-end this as well. And for that to happen, the conversation has to be broadened. So I'm encouraging you as many times, and yes, follow that request from St. Elizabeth, the most wonderful parish in the country, to go to St. Elizabeth and get the farmers, the fishermen, to be involved in this discussion.
Okay, we have a live stream question, and I've asked Elizabeth, in the interest of accuracy, her eyes are much younger than mine, to read it, and then I'm going to ask Valerie to answer it, and then we must close.
The question is coming from, I believe, Karen MacDonald Gale, and it's a question to the World Bank, IDB, and CDB about supporting the development of domestic marine shipping industries, as indicated earlier, as well as economic instruments, taxes and fees on other marine extractive industries. I guess what's coming out of your country programs to support, or is there anything coming out of these programs to support the development of domestic marine shipping industries, as well as the use of economic instruments on marine extractive industries?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Elizabeth. So rather than answer that in the most straightforward way possible, because at least from the World Bank point of view, we're not investing.
Use both.
Yeah, I'm not sure my answer will be that good to be said twice. We're not necessarily at this moment, as the World Bank, investing in marine shipping industries. But I will say something that the ambassador brought up, and that's that we have to think regionally in the Caribbean. Not every island in the Caribbean can have its own marine shipping industry. Not every island can have its own agro-processing. One of the beauties of small islands is that they can be incredibly attractive and they can produce incredibly niche items, but often the volume isn't there, the scale isn't there. And so one of the things we really need to think about, just as we think about how much of the resources don't abide by language group or island jurisdiction, we have to think about how the industries we build and the blue economy resources we want, we have to find a way to share them regionally to make sure that everybody benefits. The Pacific, Ambassador, you spoke about the Pacific being ahead, and in many ways they are. They're working very closely together, both in terms of managing the resource as a common resource, taxing it at the same levels, and this is something when it comes to fiscal instruments. We look at the cruise industry, for example, across the Caribbean, and the cruise industry has been incredibly smart about playing one island off another. I don't blame them, they're in the business of making profit. And because islands aren't cooperating enough together, there's a race to the bottom, and there are islands who are accepting tiny fees for a huge footprint. And this speaks to the issue of alignment, and not aligning, being able to take care of the resource and thinking about it regionally, with making sure that you bring the bacon, you bring the money and the jobs home. And so I would say in that sense is we really do have to think regionally. We have to recouple private gain and public loss, make sure that the public benefits as much as private companies do. And we need to make sure that the fiscal instruments are in place, and we're working very hard, not just here in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean, to help governments really understand and people demand that the fiscal instruments are there to nudge private companies and primary producers and consumers of goods towards sustainable behavior, so that as Jamaica moves into a developed country by 2030, that it stays there, and that it doesn't simply get there by 2030 only to fall backwards because all the lobster are gone, because the conch are gone, because the beaches are gone. Thank you.
Thank you. I was always told that hungry people are angry people. And I know there are many hungry people here. So you have, if I continue much longer, I'll be endangering myself, because I stand between you and the refreshments. So I'm going to bring this part of the dialogue to a close and invite you to engage the panelists in a more informal discussion if you haven't had a chance to ask your question. So let me thank very quickly the World Bank for collaborating with us. The university, over its 70 years of history, has always been the place where Caribbean policy issues have been debated and, dare I say, solved. And bringing the World Bank together brings a comparative experience which enriches that dialogue. So both institutions, I think, are to be commended. This, as you have heard, is very timely, it's very pertinent, it's an opportunity that's being missed. We have to do much more both in quality and quantity, to make use of this resource while preserving it. In that regard, I thank Valerie Hickory for coming to meet the other set of Irish. The Irish and the Jamaicans are the only people who address both genders as man. We also share a capacity for libation, and we are noted for being able to express our displeasure quite forcefully. Well, apart from those commonalities, I thank you for bringing your vast experience to the topic. Elizabeth Emmanuel, happy to hear 2030 is going from green to blue, or both. Senator Hill, I think you are the right person in the right place. Your passion for this subject, you know, after 2.5 hours is very encouraging. I commend you. Dr. Henry Mooney, your new convert on the road to the University of the West Indies. Justin Ram, thank you. I know it's very late in Barbados, but and I commend the bank for doing some additional new work. I look forward to seeing that paper. And Dr. David Smith always reminds us that if we don't preserve the environment, we won't be here much longer. So thank you for that. I thank the audience. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. And I thank all the people who worked very hard on this. I particularly mention Mr. Ian Forrest, UWI TV, and the team that have been sitting here from 2 o'clock today, waiting to take care of things and have put everything in order. I now invite you to continue the dialogue over refreshments which are available downstairs.